He had barked before at buried shell casings, at lost hikers, at raccoons bold enough to slip behind a garage in broad daylight, but this sound was different. It was not the sharp warning bark of a police dog on alert. It was slower, deeper, as if Rex were standing at the edge of something that had been silent too long. The October air in Blackwater Ridge, Pennsylvania, carried the scent of wet bark, cold earth, and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Evening was settling over the old trail system behind Miller's Creek Park, turning the maple leaves the color of rusted copper under a sky fading from pale gold to iron gray. Officer Ethan Cole tightened his grip on the leather lead and looked toward the massive oak at the edge of the path. The tree had to be at least 4 feet across, older than the town itself by the look of it, with roots like knotted rope and bark furrowed deep enough to hold shadows. Halfway up the trunk, where one thick limb twisted toward the west, a strange bulge pushed out from the wood. It looked like a tumor grown from the tree itself, rounded and ugly, larger than a basketball, slick dark from the damp. Rex stood beneath it, motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest. His ears were forward. His tail was stiff. He barked again, once, then stared at Ethan with a kind of urgency that reached under the skin. "What is it, boy?" Ethan muttered, stepping closer. His voice sounded too small in the stillness. This had been supposed to be a quiet end-of-shift patrol, nothing more than a loop through the old park after a call about trespassers cutting through the woods near the abandoned rail line. No sirens. No chase. No paperwork worth remembering. Just the kind of hour Ethan had come to prefer lately, when the town softened and people went inside and the world stopped asking him to fix what it had broken. But Rex would not move. The shepherd shifted his weight, paced once around the trunk, then returned to the exact same spot and gave a low, restrained woof that vibrated in the cooling air. Ethan felt the tiny hairs at the back of his neck lift. He had worked with Rex for 3 years. Long enough to know the dog's signals. Long enough to trust the silences between them. This was not confusion. This was insistence. A breeze moved through the trees with a dry whisper. Somewhere farther down the slope, a creek slipped over stone. The last birds had gone quiet. Ethan stepped off the trail and into the damp leaves, boots sinking half an inch into the soft ground. Up close, the bulge looked even stranger. The texture was wrong. The grain around it bent unnaturally, and one narrow seam traced along the side where no seam should have been. Ethan reached out and rested his gloved fingers against the dark swelling on the oak. The surface was cool. Too smooth in one spot. Too hollow in another. Behind him, Rex let out a faint whine, not fearful, not aggressive, but almost mournful, like a warning carried across years instead of yards. Ethan swallowed, eyes fixed on the old tree as the light drained from the woods, and for the first time that evening, he stopped feeling like they had found something. It felt like something had been waiting for them. Ethan did not call it in right away. Not because he wanted to keep secrets from the department, but because instinct told him to listen before he spoke. He crouched at the base of the oak, flashlight in one hand, the beam tracing the warped surface where the buhl knot pushed from the trunk like a scar the tree had carried for years. Rex stayed close, not restless now, but intent. His amber eyes followed every small movement of Ethan's hand. The woods around them had fallen into that strange hour between day and night when colors lose their names. The red leaves had gone brown. The path had gone gray. Even the creek down the hill sounded farther away, as if the dark itself were swallowing distance. Ethan pressed his fingers along the seam again and felt it more clearly this time, a line hidden beneath old resin and weather, too deliberate to be natural. He leaned in, catching a faint odor beneath the wet wood and moss. Metal. Old metal. His jaw tightened. "All right," he said softly, more to Rex than to himself. "You were right." Rex gave one low rumble and sat, posture straight, ears fixed on the trunk as though standing guard over a witness who could not yet speak. Ethan stepped back and swept his light across the ground. The oak stood near the forgotten edge of the park, where the maintained trail gave way to brush and the old rail corridor disappeared into trees no one bothered clearing anymore. Years ago, Kids used to come here with fishing poles and bicycles. Now only deer trails and bootleg shortcuts crossed through the undergrowth. The town had moved on from this place. Nature had not. It had simply covered what people no longer wanted to see. A gust of colder air slid through the branches, carrying the smell of rain not yet fallen. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and studied the bulge from a different angle. There it was again, the wrongness of it, not only the seam but the shape itself. Too rounded. Too even. As if something had been fitted into the trunk and then dressed over with time. He had seen enough hidden compartments in cars, basement walls, and tool sheds to know when a surface was pretending to be something it was not. The difference was that those things belonged to the living. This felt older. Quieter. Almost reverent in its silence. His radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, dispatch checking routine status on units finishing the evening patrol. Ethan reached for it, then stopped. His thumb hovered over the button. Rex turned his head toward him, alert but calm, and in that instant Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle into him with surprising clarity. If he called it in now, the place would fill with noise. Flashing lights. Voices. Boots trampling leaves. Questions before facts. But right here, right now, there was still a chance to hear the truth arrive the way it had waited to arrive, slowly. He keyed the radio only long enough to say that he was following up on a possible trail hazard and would report back in 10 minutes. It was not a lie, not exactly. When the static faded, the quiet returned heavier than before. Ethan unclipped a folding utility knife from his belt and opened it with a soft metallic snap. Rex rose immediately, not anxious, only ready. Ethan moved closer to the trunk, flashlight tucked beneath one arm, blade angled toward the edge of the seam. His breathing sounded loud in his own ears. The first careful scrape lifted a thin strip of softened bark. Beneath it was not fresh wood, but something dark and smooth, sealed against weather. Ethan froze for half a heartbeat, the knife suspended in the cold air, and Rex let out the faintest sound deep in his chest, as if both of them understood at once that whatever had been hidden here had not been placed by accident, and had not been forgotten by the dog beside him. The material beneath the bark was not wood at all. Ethan drew the blade back and stared at the dark surface now exposed in the flashlight beam. It had the dull sheen of weathered composite, something man-made, fitted with care and then disguised by years of sap, rot, and patience. He slipped the knife tip gently along the edge and felt it catch against a lip no wider than a fingernail. A cover. A panel. Something built to disappear. The realization settled into his chest like cold rain. Rex stepped closer until his shoulder brushed Ethan's leg, his body warm and steady in the deepening chill. The dog did not bark now. He only watched the tree with that unblinking focus that had once led them to a missing hiker's glove buried beneath 6 inches of snow, and to a runaway teenager hiding under an overturned John boat near Miller's Pond. But this was different from those nights. Those had carried urgency. This carried age. Ethan slid the knife away and reached for the small flat pry tool in the utility pouch on his belt. The metal felt colder than it should have. He worked the tip under the seam with patient pressure, careful not to crack whatever sat beneath. At first nothing moved. Then, with a brittle sound like old glue giving way, one side of the false cover lifted a fraction of an inch. Rex inhaled sharply. Ethan stopped. His own breath clouded white in the beam of the flashlight. He listened. No footsteps on the trail. No passing cars from the county road beyond the ridge. Only wind threading through bare branches and the creek speaking softly over stone below. He eased the panel open another inch. Damp leaves shifted under his boots. Inside the trunk, behind the disguised shell, was a narrow compartment. Lined in tarnished metal. Not deep, maybe 18 inches, but deliberate. Protected. Hidden. Ethan's pulse began to thud in his temples. Nestled inside was a rectangular box wrapped in dark oilcloth, its corners reinforced with brass gone green from age. Beside it lay something smaller, almost lost in shadow, a loop of faded blue ribbon tied around a thin object no longer visible beneath dust. Ethan felt his throat tighten without knowing why. There was no reason yet for sorrow, and still it arrived, quiet and immediate, like stepping into a church long after the service had ended and finding the air still full of prayer. Rex lowered his head toward the opening and gave a faint whine, the same mournful note he had made before, soft enough to sound almost human in the hush of the woods. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into the shepherd's thick fur. "Easy," he whispered, though he was not sure whether he meant the dog or himself. He did not reach into the compartment right away. Instead, he let the moment breathe, because some part of him understood that once he touched what had been hidden here, the evening would stop being a strange patrol and become something else entirely. His flashlight beam trembled slightly as it passed over the oilcloth bundle again. There were initials stamped into one brass corner, nearly rubbed away by time. E.M. Ethan frowned. The letters meant nothing to him, not yet. But the ribbon beside the box did. It was the kind used on school fair prizes and church bake sale tags, ordinary and small, the kind of thing no one would expect to survive a decade in silence. A memory flickered somewhere at the edge of his mind, too faint to name. Rex leaned closer, nostrils working, then lifted his gaze to Ethan's face as if asking the question neither of them could avoid now. Whatever had been waiting inside that old tree had not only been preserved. It had been placed there with intention, and somehow, against reason and weather and time, it had been waiting for them. For a long moment Ethan did not move. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him, every branch and stone suspended in the kind of silence that makes a man aware of his own heartbeat. Then, slowly, with the care of someone lifting more than weight, he reached into the compartment and drew out the oilcloth bundle. It was heavier than it looked, close to 5 pounds, the fabric stiff at the folds and cool with trap damp. He laid it gently on a patch of flattened leaves near the roots and turned back to the hollow. Rex remained still beside him, but the shepherd's ears shifted at every sound, listening beyond the trees, beyond the creek, as if he understood that finding something was only the beginning. Ethan removed the smaller item next. The faded ribbon came free in his gloved fingers, revealing a tiny silver charm attached to a fraying cord. It was shaped like a star, cheap and slightly bent, the sort of trinket sold from a spinning rack near the register in a general store. One side was engraved with a single word so worn it almost vanished into the tarnish. Hope. Ethan stared at it, and something old stirred in his memory, not a picture yet, only a feeling. A summer fair. A bulletin board in the station break room. A child smiling in a school photo pinned beside a missing persons flyer that had long ago yellowed at the edges. His chest tightened. He looked back at the initials stamped on the brass corner of the box. E.M. The letters no longer felt random. He unwrapped the oilcloth one fold at a time until the brass-reinforced case lay exposed in the flashlight beam. It was no treasure chest, nothing ornate, just a plain metal document box with a stubborn latch and a handle darkened by rust. On the lid, beneath streaks of age, was a strip of cracked masking tape. Faded handwriting crossed it in blue ink. Property. The rest had bled into illegibility. Ethan swallowed hard and ran a thumb over the letters without opening the latch. Property. Evidence. Keepsake. The woods gave him no answer. A sound drifted from behind him, and he turned sharply, pulse jumping, but it was only the faint creak of old branches rubbing in the breeze. Even so, the feeling of being watched settled over him, not by a person, not exactly, but by the town itself, by all the years that had passed while this box sat hidden in the dark. Rex stepped around him and faced the trail, body squared, guarding the opening in the tree and the objects now resting at its base. Ethan had seen that posture before on search scenes, when the dog sensed the shift between uncertainty and truth. He drew a slow breath and finally took out his phone. There was one bar of signal, flickering weakly, enough to make him hesitate. If he called now, this would become official in seconds. Photos. Chain of custody. Supervisors. Questions he could not yet answer. He snapped 3 quick pictures instead, one of the hidden compartment, one of the box in the leaves, and one of the silver star charm lying in his palm like a tiny witness. Then his phone buzzed in his hand so suddenly he nearly dropped it. A message from dispatch flashed across the screen. Unit 7, status check. Report location. Ethan looked from the screen to the tree, to Rex, to the dim trail fading into night, and something colder than the air moved through him. 10 minutes had passed faster than he realized. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the first low roll of thunder touched the sky. Rain was coming. Darkness was closing. And whatever this box had guarded for all these years was no longer hidden. Ethan wiped his thumb across the rain-damp screen and keyed the radio before dispatch could call again. His voice came out steady, though his pulse had not yet caught up with it. Unit 7 at Miller's Creek West Trail boundary, he said. Possible concealed property located in a tree cavity near the old rail corridor. Securing scene. Requesting supervisor and evidence unit. The reply crackled back through static, clipped and routine, but the words barely registered. Once spoken, they changed everything. What had been a private moment between a man, a dog, and a hidden truth was now moving into the bright machinery of the law. Ethan slid the phone into his pocket and looked at the brass box again. The first drops of rain tapped against the leaves overhead, light at first, then steadier, darkening the bark and deepening the smell of earth around them. Rex remained planted at the trail's edge, broad chest forward, ears high, as if he knew the next few minutes mattered more than the last few years. Ethan crouched beside the box and studied the latch. He did not want to open it before witnesses arrived. Every rule in him said wait. But another instinct, older and quieter, told him that storms ruined more than evidence. They ruined moments. They erased delicate things. The little silver star lay in his palm again, catching the last of the light. Hope. The word felt less like decoration now and more like a whisper from another time. He slipped the charm carefully into an evidence bag from his belt pouch, then held the flashlight closer to the box. Under the cracked masking tape and corrosion, he noticed a second marking pressed into the metal itself, shallow but visible when the beam struck it sideways. Case file. The number that followed was faded, but not gone. Ethan leaned nearer, rain cool against the back of his neck. 17-0-4. Then 2 letters. MC, Miller's Creek. His breath caught. The station had old files boxed in basement storage, decades of reports from before the digital archive was complete, but Ethan knew enough to recognize the style. Local case numbering. Department property. This had not been some stranger's hiding place. Someone inside the system had put it here. A chill passed through him that had nothing to do with October rain. Rex turned suddenly toward the trail and gave one sharp bark. Not alarm. Arrival. Headlights flickered weakly through the trees from the service access road beyond the brush, pale bands of light cutting through mist and branches. Ethan should have felt relief. Instead, an unease settled deeper in his stomach. If the box belonged to an old department case, then whoever had hidden it had worn a badge, or stood close enough to one to know how things disappeared. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, low and heavy over the ridge. Ethan rested one hand on the brass lid, not opening it, only feeling the cold certainty of it beneath his palm. He remembered a story his father used to tell when Ethan was a boy, back when his father still wore a uniform and the kitchen smelled like black coffee before dawn. The truth does not stay buried forever, he would say. It just waits for weather. Ethan had not thought of those words in years. Now, kneeling beneath an old oak with rain beginning to fall and Rex standing watch like a sentry carved from loyalty itself, he understood them in a way he never had before. Somewhere inside that brass box was a reason. A name. A choice someone had made and hidden from the light. And as the first cruiser door slammed in the distance and footsteps hurried through wet leaves toward them, Ethan realized with a slow, sinking certainty that they were no longer at the beginning of a discovery. They were standing at the edge of a betrayal. Deputy Mara Bennett was the first to reach the oak, her boots slick with rain and her navy jacket already dark at the shoulders. She stopped short when she saw the open panel in the trunk, the brass box on the ground, and Rex standing beside it like a living boundary line. Behind her came Sergeant Daniel Hargrove from the evidence unit, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, carrying a weatherproof case and wearing the expression of a man who had spent 30 years learning not to look surprised. But even he slowed when Ethan pointed his flashlight toward the hidden compartment in the tree. For a moment none of them spoke. Rain tapped softly on leaves overhead. Water gathered along the grooves of the old bark and slipped down like tears the tree had held too long. "You found this with Rex?" Mara asked at last, her voice lower than usual. Ethan nodded. He would not leave the spot. Hargrove crouched, careful with his footing, and examined the false panel without touching it. His eyes narrowed at the workmanship, then shifted to the box, then to the small evidence bag in Ethan's hand with the silver star charm inside. Something changed in his face then, subtle but real, as though an old door had opened somewhere behind his eyes. "Do not open anything yet," he said quietly. But the words came a second too late, because Mara had already angled her light across the faded case number Ethan had read from the metal. Her breath caught. 1704. She murmured. Miller's Creek. Ethan looked at her sharply. "You know it?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she stared at the silver charm through the plastic bag, rain beating on her lashes, and whispered a name that seemed too small for the night around them. Emily Mercer. The woods fell still again. Ethan felt the name strike somewhere deep, joining the fragments that had followed him all evening. The school fair ribbon. The old flyer. The bulletin board in the break room when he was barely old enough to understand why adults went quiet around missing children. Emily Mercer had been 8 years old when she vanished on the walk home from a church picnic nearly 12 years ago. The case had lived in town like a bruise that never quite faded. No clear witness. No clean answer. Just posters, candlelight, casseroles left on porches, and then the long American silence that settles after hope becomes too painful to say out loud. Hargrove closed his eyes for half a breath, then opened them and pulled on fresh gloves. "I was a patrolman that summer," he said, almost to himself. "I remember the ribbon. Her mother tied one on every fence post between Main Street and the creek." He reached for the latch with the kind of care people use around sacred things. Even Rex, who had not moved for several minutes, lowered his head slightly as if the air itself had become heavier. The latch resisted, stiff with time, then gave with a soft metallic click that sounded far louder than it should have. No one breathed. Hargrove lifted the lid. Inside, sealed in waxed envelopes and wrapped against moisture, lay a stack of old reports, several Polaroid photographs, and a child's small knit mitten the color of pale blue dusk. On top of everything was a typed cover sheet from the Blackwater Ridge Police Department bearing the same case number, and a line stamped in red across the upper corner. Supplementary evidence not filed. Mara went pale. Ethan felt the rain on his face and did not know whether the cold in his chest came from weather or from the terrible clarity of what they were seeing. This was not lost property. This was not forgotten paperwork. Someone had chosen to remove part of Emily Mercer's story from the record and hide it inside a living tree, trusting time to do what conscience would not. And beside Ethan, Rex stood silent and unwavering, as if he had led them not merely to evidence, but to the exact place where the truth had stopped breathing and begun to wait. The rain grew steadier, turning the leaves underfoot slick and black, but no one moved to leave. Mara took the top envelope from the box with gloved hands and held it beneath Ethan's flashlight. The seal had cracked with age, and inside was a typed interview summary dated 3 days after Emily Mercer disappeared. At the bottom sat a signature line Ethan recognized before his mind accepted it. Chief Walter Cole. His father. For one terrible second the woods seemed to tilt around him. The creek below kept moving. The rain kept falling. Rex pressed lightly against his leg as if sensing the shift in the man beside him. Ethan stared at the page, the letters blurring, then sharpening again. His father had been chief back then, a careful man with quiet habits, the kind of officer who polished his shoes before sunrise and never left a question half answered at the dinner table. He had died 6 years earlier of a heart condition, leaving behind a cedar chest of fishing lures, old service pins, and a reputation this town still spoke of with softened voices. Ethan had spent most of his life trying to stand near that memory without feeling small. Now his father's name lay on a paper hidden in a tree. Mara looked up at him, worry and caution mixing in her eyes, but she said nothing. Hargrove took the page next and read in silence, rain tapping on the brim of his cap. "This is not a confession," he said at last, voice low and careful. "It is an interview note. Look here." He pointed to a line halfway down the sheet. Witness observed blue pickup parked near West Rail Crossing at 4:20 p.m. Driver identified as local parks contractor. Follow-up recommended. Ethan exhaled slowly. The breath trembled on the way out. It was not his father being accused on the page. It was something else, something somehow worse. A lead had existed. A named lead. And it had never made it into the filed case summary. Hargrove reached for the next document, then the next. The papers inside the box were dried despite the years, preserved with a kind of grim devotion. There were hand-drawn maps of the trail system from before the county rerouted the creekside footbridge. There were 2 Polaroids of tire marks near the old rail bed. There was a receipt from a machine shop on the edge of town linked by initials to the same parks contractor. And beneath those, folded into a wax sleeve, there was a memo stamped received by the department but never indexed, warning that the contractor had abruptly sold his truck and left Pennsylvania less than a week after Emily disappeared. Mara covered her mouth with the back of her glove. "My mother used to say the town gave up too early," she whispered. "She said somebody made the choice for them." Hargrove did not answer. His face had gone older somehow, lined not by rain but by remembrance. "There were rumors," he said. "Back then the contractor had cousins on the council. Money. Influence. People get afraid of what a scandal will do to a town already bleeding jobs." Ethan looked at the hidden compartment in the oak and felt something hollow open inside him. Not rage. Not yet. Something sadder. The kind of grief that comes when the good name of a place you loved begins to peel back. His father's signature was on the interview sheet because he had received it. But the papers had not vanished in his handwriting. The masking tape, the oilcloth, the false panel, all of it spoke of planning done later, by someone who knew the file and feared what it still contained. Rex lifted his nose toward the open box and then turned his gaze to Ethan, steady and unwavering, as if reminding him that names on paper were not the end of truth, only the beginning of the path toward it. Ethan knelt in the rain, the flashlight beam trembling faintly across old reports and faded photographs, and understood with a cold and painful clarity that the betrayal hidden in the tree had not destroyed his father's legacy. It had used it as cover. By the time the evidence box was sealed and loaded into Hargrove's vehicle, the rain had softened to a fine silver mist that clung to the oak branches and turned every flashlight beam into a pale halo. The scene tape fluttered weakly between saplings, marking the place where something hidden had finally been named. Ethan stood a few yards back with one hand resting on Rex's collar, watching as Mara photographed the compartment again from 3 angles and Hargrove dictated the preliminary log in that measured voice officers use when they are trying to keep emotion from entering the record. But emotion was already there. It was in the way Mara blinked too often when she looked at the blue mitten. It was in the heaviness of Hargrove's shoulders when he said the words supplementary evidence. It was in the quiet that settled over the woods once the practical tasks were done, and no one had another excuse to look away. "I am reopening the Mercer case first thing in the morning," Hargrove said, snapping his notebook shut. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sentence carried through the damp air with the weight of a bell tolling in church country. Mara nodded once, almost fiercely. "The family should hear it from us before rumors do." Ethan looked toward the dark trail where the town lay beyond the ridge, porch lights glowing through drizzle, windows bright with ordinary dinners and late television and people folding laundry, unaware that the old wound beneath their streets had begun to stir again. Blackwater Ridge had spent 12 years turning Emily Mercer into a photograph at memorial walks and a name spoken gently in grocery aisles. People had learned how to live around the missing space she left. What they had not known, what someone had counted on them never knowing, was that part of her story had been preserved in silence within walking distance of a public trail. Rex leaned into Ethan's leg, then lifted his head toward the oak one last time. The shepherd's ears twitched, listening to something no human could hear. Ethan followed the dog's gaze to the open cavity in the trunk, now empty except for damp darkness and the outline of where the box had rested. The tree looked older now, not sinister, just tired, as if it had carried a burden that was never meant for roots and sap and rain. "You think somebody local did the hiding?" Mara asked quietly. Hargrove did not answer at once. He looked at the compartment, then at the files secured in the back of his unit, then at Ethan. "Local enough to know what mattered," he said. "Local enough to believe memory would die before wood did." The words settled deep. Ethan thought of his father's signature again, of the clean block letters on that old page, of the lead he had once received and the truth that had somehow slipped away after landing in the right hands. He no longer felt the first panic that had struck him when he saw the name. In its place was something steadier. Sorrow, yes, but also resolve. Whatever came next, he would not let his father's memory be used to shield another man's cowardice. The rain thinned further, leaving only droplets falling from leaf tips in slow, patient rhythm. Somewhere down the slope, the creek kept moving under the footbridge, carrying twigs, reflections, and pieces of sky toward places no one could see from here. Hargrove gave final instructions, the scene was logged, and the team began the slow walk back toward the cruisers. Ethan lingered a moment longer beneath the oak. He knelt and touched the bark near the hidden opening, rough and cold beneath his glove. "You held it as long as you could," he murmured, almost without meaning to. Rex stood beside him, silent and faithful, his breath rising white in the damp night. Then Ethan rose, turned toward the waiting lights beyond the trees, and understood that what had begun here would not end with a box of papers or a reopened file. It would move through the town like dawn through fog, slowly, quietly, until even those who had spent years looking away would have to see what the dog had seen first, that some truths do not vanish, and some loyalties are strong enough to lead them home. Morning came to Blackwater Ridge under a low ceiling of clouds and a silence that felt earned. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the streets washed clean and the sycamores along Main Street dripping silver into the gutters. At 7:30, Ethan parked outside the Mercer home with Rex in the back seat and watched the porch for a moment before stepping out. The house was smaller than he expected, a white clapboard place with blue shutters fading toward gray, the kind of home built to hold ordinary years. There were mums on the steps, a brass bell by the door, and on the front window, tucked discreetly in one corner, a ribbon sticker the same soft shade of blue as the mitten from the box. Mrs. Mercer opened the door before he could knock twice. Time had thinned her face but not her bearing. She stood straight in a cream cardigan, one hand resting against the frame as if she had learned long ago that bad news arrives better when you are already braced for it. Ethan introduced himself gently, and when he asked if he could come in, her eyes moved past him to Rex. Something in her expression loosened, not into comfort, but into recognition of the kind that grief sometimes gives. She led them to the living room, where a photograph of a little girl in a yellow church dress stood on the mantel between two candles burned nearly to their bases. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old hymnals. Ethan did not rush. He told her there had been a development in the case. He told her evidence had been located. He told her the department was reopening everything. He did not promise more than he could give, and yet when he placed the clear evidence pouch on the coffee table and the silver star charm caught the morning light, Mrs. Mercer covered her mouth and closed her eyes as if a door she had held shut for 12 years had finally opened on its own. "I tied that on her bag for the church picnic," she whispered. "She said it looked like something from heaven." The room went very still. Rex, who had remained by Ethan's knee the entire time, stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, and lowered himself at Mrs. Mercer's feet. He did not nudge. He did not whine. He only rested there, head bowed, the way some souls know how to keep vigil without being asked. Mrs. Mercer looked at him for a long moment, and then, with trembling fingers, placed her hand on the shepherd's head. "He found her voice," she said barely above a breath. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Outside, a church bell rang the quarter hour, soft through the damp morning air. At the station by noon, the reopened file had already begun to move. Old names surfaced. Archived payroll records were requested. A retired clerk remembered a contractor who left town in too much of a hurry. Mara found council minutes from that summer with one line missing from the public copy and present in the draft. Hargrove worked without pause, sleeves rolled, eyes tired but clear, as if the burden of waiting had finally given way to the grace of action. Nothing was solved in a day. Real truth rarely arrives that cleanly. But something holier than certainty had returned to the case. Motion. By dusk, Ethan drove back past Miller's Creek Park with Rex beside him and slowed near the service road leading to the old trail. The oak stood beyond the trees, unseen from where he was, yet he could feel its presence all the same, that patient witness rooted in earth and weather. He thought of the box hidden in living wood, of his father's signature preserved beside a truth someone else had feared, of a mother who had waited with a ribbon in her hand and no answer worthy of her child. Then he looked at Rex, at the steady amber eyes and the calm rise of breath in the gathering dark, and he understood something simple enough to be missed by louder men. Justice does not always begin with sirens. Sometimes it begins with the dog who will not walk away. Sometimes mercy arrives on four quiet paws and stands beneath an old tree until a weary heart finally listens. And in a world that forgets too easily, that kind of loyalty is its own small miracle.